Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the newest album, the final album from David Bowie, titled Blackstar. David Bowie. That should be all I really need to say for this introduction. But the reality is that David Bowie was always a lot more complicated than the legendary image and stunning run of classic albums have indicated. One of the most fascinating creative geniuses to have ever worked in music, especially during his run in the 70s, which was just glorious. When you have an artist that influential, that powerful, that genre-defying, it's hard to say anything more beyond the music speaks for itself. But to be completely honest with you all, putting aside my knowledge of some of his best music, I had never gone through David Bowie's entire discography front to back before doing this review. Certain albums, sure, but never from beginning to end. So before I sat down to listen to Blackstar in full, I went through every single David Bowie album, from the uneven self-titled Curiosity into his classic albums in the early 70s that are just glorious and still hold up to this day, to the mid to late 70s stream of genre bending and krautrock, to his stabs at the mainstream throughout the 80s to kind of mixed results, and yet it would only get kind of worse from there. Yeah, the 90s and his brief period of activity in the beginning of the 2000s was not exactly kind to the guy. Mostly good, but far from the heights he achieved with Station to Station, the Berlin Trilogy, Hunky Dory, Ziggy Stardust, and my personal favorite David Bowie album, The Man Who Sold the World. Most of that is because I didn't prefer David Bowie when he got rougher and darker, and while I can definitely appreciate some of the more pop-flavored records like Let's Dance, I like the heavier stuff a little bit more, just my preference. One of the reasons I've got more time for his hard rock side project, Tin Machine, than most do. And yet, for his 90s work, look, where in the past he was the one who charted a more unique path, his work in this decade almost seemed to entirely cannibalize the electronic and industrial music at the time in order to wring out some fresh inspiration with some hit and miss results. Underrated results to this day, but still kind of hit and miss, and nowhere near his classics. And while albums like Heathen and Reality showed him regain a lot of creative form, I was satisfied with David Bowie gracefully stepping out of the spotlight in around 2003-2004. A varied career, but the heights by far outshadowed the lows. So fast forward to 2013, and out of nowhere, David Bowie released The Next Day, his first album material in a decade. And not only did it feel creatively revitalized, it was David Bowie taking his textbook self-awareness and focusing on his own legacy, half out of the sheer provocation of rebirth and have to break free of the ossifying weight of his classics. Never had the specter of death and endings hung quite so heavily over the thin white duke, now without reason as we'd come to know, and yet he was gonna go out swinging, and I can definitely respect that. It's not hyperbole to say that The Next Day was the best album he had made since the 80s, a shot of buzzing, excellently written momentum that managed to recapture the best the ragged danger that had ran through his best work, and thus, when I heard he was going to be following it up with an album this year, this time tapping into more experimental jazz than what was heralded as one of his most experimental and dark albums to date, well, look, it's not like jazz was entirely unfamiliar territory. Look at the title track from Aladdin Sane. In other words, especially now, you can bet that I was going to review this album. So, what did Blackstar deliver? Well, I gotta be honest here. I struggle a lot with this record in this review, partially because it's David Bowie. I want to make sure I was giving it my fair consideration and respect, but also because on the first 2 to 3 listens, I was underwhelmed by this album. I'm not gonna say that it was a bad record by any stretch of the mind. It was definitely not, and I've definitely warmed to it a lot over the past dozen listens I gave it over the past few days, especially today, but it wasn't until a final few listens today that it truly snapped into focus. An album that when viewed in the context of its subtle influences and the passing of a legend, it rings as borderline prophetic, and how many artists have the ability to write their own swan song? So let's start by talking about David Bowie himself. And honestly, if I'm gonna have a criticism of this album, yeah, I'm still gonna be a critic here, is that his performance is kind of uneven. Yes, I know why that was the case, and that it does work at points in context with his lyrics and themes and his own physical condition. I'm giving him a lot of pass here, but he did write his own vocal lines, and there are points on the title track, and especially on Girl Loves Me, where the cracks and breaks in his voice are pretty audible. And yeah, they can't help but take away from a fragile but otherwise pretty damn impressive and soulful performance, especially on the final 2 tracks of this album, which are goddamn heartbreaking. And while I can appreciate the production doing whatever it can to help, this is where I have my second big issue with this album. As I said before, my favorite David Bowie albums are the ones that rocked a little bit harder, and this album's choice to draw from the stripped-back rhythms of Low and the spacier abstraction of Outside, well, it wouldn't be my favorite source of his influences, especially considering how Tony Vicotti's production seemed to soften every rougher edge. I'll come back to this when I talk about lyrical themes, but for how bleak the the atmosphere of this album is. Ghostly, half-heard backing vocals, sparse percussion, heavenly swells of strings, jittery flutes, liquid yet rigid basswork, all against a cushion of hazy synth and a saxophone that seems to spasm and leap across the mix with reckless abandon. I find myself wishing there was a hint more of a bite to this album, especially when those more ragged guitars managed to sneak in. Granted, it's still damn impressive that David Bowie can compose music that ran the line between unsettling yet strangely approachable without needing to rely on darker textures, but I can't help but wonder what might have been. Now that's not to take away from any of the compositions themselves, which have so many beautiful subtleties that add a ton to the mix. That little 6 or 7 note gleaming synth piece that accents "'Tis a Pity She Was a Whore," the darker bass work on Lazarus that features a fantastic fuzzed out riff, then the horns that then mirror, the industrial touches that intensify the ragged panic of Sue or In a Season of Crime, the phenomenal acoustic texture on Dollar Days that features some gorgeous subtle backing piano, and that great guitar cutting through the outro, and finally, on a cloud of effervescent keys, brittle hi-hats, and the horns that accentuated the eeriness before merging with the guitars to pull him home on the finale. Yeah, this is where any hope of me being remotely objective in this criticism pretty much collapses, because we have to talk about lyrics and themes, and the hardest question to grapple with. Does David Bowie's death and passing lend this album weight and power that it otherwise would not have had it not been released just days before his death, which nobody could have known, or if it was released by some other artist? Because let's be honest, every artist has considered what they'd want their swan song project to be. David Bowie more than most. He's been privately fighting cancer for the past year and a half. He knew it was coming even if we didn't. And this is where consideration of his influences snaps into focus and becomes important. Musically, you can hear the Boards of Canada influence, obviously, but reportedly David Bowie drew more inspiration from 2 hip-hop acts, the first being Kendrick Lamar. And that makes sense, especially considering all the jazzy side, especially when you consider To Pimp a Butterfly, internal struggles with fame, being held up as a savior but losing contact with the world beneath him. Hell, he even describes himself as a black star, the antithesis to the modern disposable pop icon that isn't shy about piling on the Antichrist imagery around him. And that's before we get to Lazarus, where he makes the prophetic distance from his audience all the more stark. Not shying away from the corruptive force of cancer, he almost seems to relish the potential release of death, no longer the dead man walking. And that nihilism has a direct parallel to the other major influence in this album, Death Grips. Now, at first glimpse, that influence is barely evident. It's not like David Bowie's voice would be even capable of howling like MC Rides, but there's a certain self-flagellating savagery that wouldn't be out of place on Jenny Death, especially how this album and that album ended. But of course, since David Bowie, his brand of savagery had a certain refined transgression to it. The most obvious case coming in the use of Nadsat and Polari, slang languages derived from A Clockwork Orange, and the 70s gay nightclub scene respectively, on Girl Loves Me, where he comments on a woman who might bring great pleasures but damnation along the way, which is previously echoed in the garish stories of 'Tis a Pity She Was a Whore or Sue in a Season of Crime. 2 songs that previously landed on the compilation Nothing Has Changed and are inspired by the titular John Ford play from the first psalm, which is loaded with its own brand of transgression and incest, lies, betrayals, and murder. It were these moments that almost made me think that David Bowie was perhaps indulging a bit in Nick Cave-esque graphic content, but I'd argue it runs deeper than that. I mean, given David Bowie's penchant for gender bending, perhaps he himself was the whore in question to an audience that discarded the deeper connection deep down that they crave, which gets even more twisted in near direct retelling on Sue or In a Season of Crime, where David Bowie writes from the perspective of the 2 men wooing this girl, one being her brother and main lover who kills her in the end. If that's commentary on the possessive industry or of the audience, potentially, I don't know what is. And I wouldn't say these moments demonize sex. Hell, in the lines on Dollar Days, here he describes it as survival sex. Seems like those fleshy pursuits are one of the elements that are keeping him most alive, which is another Death Grips parallel as he continues to spit in the face of an establishment and legacy even as his own life begins to slip away. And then there's the heartbreaking final track. Even as he sees death's long road at his feet, he tries to refine his message down to a final stanza. Seeing more and feeling less. Saying no, but meaning yes. That is all I ever meant. That is the message that I sent. Detached to find transcendence, yet never giving up the feelings you dare not speak. With this album finding its greatest humanity and putting forward the rawest of it all before the end. Even then, he can't give everything away. That moment takes Bowie's hyper-awareness surrounding his legacy and his audience and give them one last farewell, because as the harmonica fragments that pepper the song signify, got a career in a new town now. But now we have to address that impossible question. How much of this album's resonance comes with knowing that it was written as David Bowie's final piece, defining his exit as only he could, which always will leave the lyric as "where the fuck did Monday go" as eerily prophetic. Outside of the context of his death, does Blackstar work? So let me pose a different question. Could a work like this even exist without the unique context and author that created it? In principle, perhaps, but David Bowie understood that his authorial presence rings as unique within the history of modern music, the blessing and curse that it was, as the title track emphasizes. And his passing doesn't change the meaning of his music so much as it does amplify its emotional resonance. Hits that much harder. And as a critic, admitting that doesn't invalidate the past few minutes. You're only human in experiencing art, be you a critic or a fan. And to ignore that human context devalues the raw humanity behind the most visceral moments on this album as a whole. And that being said, I will not say Blackstar is my favorite David Bowie album. Man Who Sold the World and most of his 70s output is downright classics, pretty unbeatable. But I'm not gonna deny it's an incredibly well-written piece and a haunting work that comes highly recommended. I can't say that you won't find something to get out of this, getting a strong 8 out of 10 from me. I'm not gonna say this album is the most easy or accessible work to delve into David Bowie, especially if you don't know him. I expect a lot of its resonance will come from a broader familiarity of all his albums. But for an artist to define his own swan song before transcending us all, man, what a way to go.